Hello, Romantics. I'm Sarah Gomez, author, romance lover, and host. You're listening to Romancing the Story, a podcast centered around writing, reading, and story structure, all with a twist of romance. We're at episode 59, and on today's episode, I speak with Susan Sheehey about different types of external conflict, the right amount of conflict, and what kind of stakes work for a story. As a friend of the podcast, Susan's name may look familiar, as she was one of the first guests I ever had on Romancing the Story, all the way back on episode number 4. Also, if I've ever mentioned a Susie who helps with plot holes or likes explosions in books, she is that Susie. During the discussion, we get a little nerdy about finding ways to keep track of conflicts or even tropes in order to avoid introducing too many conflicts and dropping them later. It will drive me crazy when I see a subplot I'm interested in and it never gets resolved, even though I've been guilty of doing that in my writing too. Our methods may be a little different, but it's all about what works best for you and your writing. Our conversation centers on subgenres within romance. It's also applicable to other genres, like thrillers, mystery, fantasy, etc. If your story has stakes and conflict, you might find value in this episode. Besides being a romance author, Susan is a developmental editor, and she is such a great resource whenever I get stuck in my writing. I highly recommend her services. She is very talented at honing into an issue and helping you make the most out of your story. Her contact information can be found in the show description, as well as links to her books, which does include an Amazon affiliate link. I know there are still ongoing efforts to provide aid after the devastating MAUI fires and have included links in the show description for anyone who is able to help. My heart and thoughts go out to those who have been affected and hope that the path to healing and recovery will be smooth and steady. With that said, let's jump right in. Welcome, award-winning romance author, Susan Sheehey. Yay!
Thanks for having me.
Susie, I'm really excited because I know that we've kind of talked about this for a little bit. I think we came up with this kind of harebrained idea back in January this year. It's been 7 months in the making. But yes. I, in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Yes, I'm Susan Sheehey. I write romantic suspense, contemporary romance, and romantic comedies. All of my stories and characters embrace flaws and highlight the imperfections. So main characters are living with some flaw or issue that their love interest doesn't view as a flaw, but embraces it and loves the imperfections anyway. I'm also a developmental editor and an audiobook producer. So I dabble in quite a bit.
I feel like that's kind of the name of the game nowadays for indie authors, is that you kind of are a multifaceted, author of some sort, because you're trying to make sure that your books reach the right audience,
Oh, yeah. You kind of have to be in today's market. So you don't have to be a master of everything. You've got to be able to at least navigate the different areas. So, yeah.
Right. And find the lane that you kind of excel at. Right. Yes. And kind of just work with that, because that's kind of what I've seen a lot, is just a lot of authors kind of will throw a lot of things at the wall and just kind of see what sticks.
Exactly.
And you'd be surprised what sticks. I have been I think we were just talking about it right before we jumped in the interview, but I was telling you which episodes I found that I gambled on or I took a chance on and then just kind of seemed to work. So It's been really interesting to see which ones, people really respond to and don't. So in case listeners have listened to the podcast for a long time, I know that they probably have heard me mention the infamous Susie, who helps fix stalled momentum and plot holes in in my writing or in friends' writing. And you are the Susie.
This is me.
That is you. I mean, when we talk about external conflict, I consider that to be like external forces preventing a character from achieving a goal.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you are incredibly talented in finding like the right driving force that serves a story. I know you've helped me. You've helped Chrissy, who's also been on the podcast, and Kim, too, who's also been on the podcast. You have helped us all kind of like navigate some of those forces of like, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? So when going into a story, how do you determine the main external conflict?
That is the main thing I always focus on are what most writers know as the GMCs, the goals, the motivations, and the conflicts. And what drives the conflict most are the character's goals and motivations. So you have to ask, what's the main character's top goal in life and the focus in the story? And in every single scene, that has to tie into the conflict that you've built in. So discover whatever conflict you want that goes against or makes the character struggle to get their goal or struggle with the motivation they have. So I always make sure that primary external conflict is in direct disalignment with the main goals. Does that make sense? So so I've got an example in Royals of Solana. So Prince Andre, who's the main character, his main external conflict starts out not having his father's approval and being exiled from his family, which we make worse straight from the first chapter with his father, who's assassinated. So not only will he never be able to resolve that conflict with his father, but things are thrown into more chaos when the same assassins come after him. So his main goal is to have his father's approval and to not be exiled anymore. And now the main conflict, boom, he can't get home. He can't find his way home. He can't get back. So just focusing on the main external conflict is going against what their main goal is. So that's how I set things up.
And that's like, I like how you kind of approach that too, because I think that's kind of recentering the character and asking, okay, what is their main motivation? What is that driving force behind them that they need to get to? Because yes. I think we get sometimes when you're writing, especially, I know I have that problem really badly, is I get lost in the weeds of too many things, going on to where I almost lose that goal in mind of like, I know where I want to go, but how am I going to get there?
Right.
So, and sometimes the ways like I'm going way off track. So of what I necessarily want to go for as far as the goal. And that's something I found like doing research into this episode is I actually found a resource that kind of honed in to different types of external conflicts. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I kind of sent you some of those that I had found. And I don't know if you've ever heard that, like the character versus character, which is what you were kind of, talking about. An assassin, went after Andre in your Royals of Solana series. Or there's a character versus environment. And then there's a character versus society. And like, it can be like any combo of the three, or it can be like, depending on how crazy you want to get with your writing, it could be all three, who knows? Which type do you typically use for your romance writing, and how do you use it?
For most of my stories, I use all three, but the main one I normally start with is the character versus character, because those always seem to be the most complex and the most intriguing for readers. But I love layering them all in together. Being able to introduce multiple external conflicts to kind of exacerbate the main external conflict is always so compelling, and it just keeps you wanting to read more and more. So while I tend to drift towards character versus character, I love filtering in and layering them all in together. I've got an example about the Royals of Solana series. Again, I'll bring that back in. Princess Alana's conflict to escape the assassins that are after her and regain control of her family's legacy. It's direct character versus character conflict, but things get worse or plot thickens, so to speak, with each step. And I throw in a character versus environment the yacht that she escapes on enters into a storm and disables the yacht. And then there's other character versus society that I throw in there. Wherever she goes, she's one of the most familiar faces in all of the international world. So paparazzi keeps finding her, and that gives the villains a clue as to where she is. So I throw in other conflicts of different types just to help keep things dramatic, right? Keep the story moving forward and make the stakes higher, so to speak. So introducing more external conflicts before resolving the main one, all layered in throughout, it creates additional tension. It escalates the emotional connections between the characters that way. That's kind of the way I build things in.
Well, and I love how you mentioned that, because there's one thing I remember while reading the Royals of Solana series that that I didn't pick up on, I don't think, until now, because I know you say you layer them in, and I loved that you did that because there was always something moving the story forward, and I felt like there was always this kind of like a ticking clock up above them, because I know that you had like the main, like you said, the main external conflict was character versus character. I got to get away from this assassin. I got to stay safe. I got to stay. But there was also that added layer that you would integrate every now and again about being worried about someone finding out their identity, right? Because they were, like you said, this well-known figure. So like there was always that, is somebody going to find me? And then paparazzi are going to, give away my location, or someone's going to give away my location to where they do find me. So that was always a piece of it as well. That was kind of, I guess, character versus society, maybe? Question mark. And then you'd put them in sometimes different environments, which again could be another one of like, it's a different environment. A lot of times you placed these characters into different environments that they weren't used to. So they had to navigate that as well. And those are big pieces, I think, that I don't think when we look at as writers, we're not conscious about it, but it is something that can help us move like the story along, like those tropes of like fish out of water, which can be the environment piece, or society, if it's a biased system of some sort, like they're working against the grain, or even the character versus character. I know that's usually where where I work as far as like the main conflict. The one you helped me with in particular, I remember I had a character versus character, and I was like, okay, where do I go from here? Because I know that there's a conflict I want the character to come against, but he doesn't directly come into the main baddie yet. Like he doesn't directly confront the bad guy yet. And so you helped me figure it out by putting it of a character. It was probably character versus environment, because then you put me into a place where the character was in a new environment. They didn't know what to do. And it pushed them towards the conflict of facing the bad guy, basically. And is that kind of when you do the character versus character, is that in kind of a lot of your stories? Because I know you write different, like your sweet spot, I think, is kind of the romantic suspense, right?
Yeah, I kind of tend I'll dabble in other stuff for a little bit, and I always gravitate back to the romantic suspense. I'm a big fan of those adventure romance stories. Our group has joked that in every single one of my romantic suspense books, something blows up.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, that's always like, it's Susie's book when something blows up. So I love that, because I think that is really cool. There's always that dynamic there. And I think that works so well for romantic suspense, especially as the character versus character, because it makes it so much more interesting, I think, when you have like kind of a bad guy to kind of try to work away from or work towards, maybe even. Yeah. But do you see yourself writing character versus character as an external conflict when you are outside of romantic suspense, or do you see that sometimes in other writing?
Yes, you can definitely still do character versus character outside of romantic suspense. So again, because when you're doing character versus character, even like romantic comedies, that kind of thing, the individual makeup of the characters themselves, you want them to clash. You want them to have conflict between each other. The really best character interactions are the ones where their goals may not align. And like this person's goal can't happen if they achieve their goal over here. So when their personalities are in direct conflict with each other, when what drives them and what motivates them are in direct conflict with each other, that's just going to naturally create drama and conflict on the page. So,
and Andre and
yes.
Gemma, I mean, because you think about it, it's a character versus character can almost be like enemies to lovers kind of thing.
Yeah, almost, right? The whole opposites attract kind of concept, but taken to the whole enemies to lover trope.
Mm-hmm.
They're two completely different characters. Andre is royalty. He's lived a life of privilege and luxury. He's very wealthy. He's highly educated, and he's had people doing things for him his entire life. Where Gemma, she's a country girl. There's no frills. There's no welfare, minimal education, and she cannot stand pompous people and who can't take care of themselves. Just that those two personalities, I mean, they're going to clash, and they definitely clashed. But at the same time, they also fascinated each other, right? They challenged each other's the stereotypes they had in their minds about what the other person was like. So that it created a lot of drama on the page.
It did, but it made it so interesting. That's what that's kind of what gets me, I think, is the when there's a lot of dynamics between like a character, two characters in particular, not necessarily that if they do clash, it can be very interesting. But if they kind of like they're just so different, it makes it so cool to watch. I think that's when you get the standout characters, is when you get a different character that kind of stands out from the rest, kind of opposed to the rest of the group, not necessarily in a bad way. And character versus character doesn't necessarily mean you have to have like a baddie versus a bad guy versus a good guy, right? It could be just two, like you said, two opposing forces that they're just very different from each other, and they kind of clash on maybe ideology or the way they do things or personalities or even goals in mind, like you said.
Right. In the Sweet Escape series that I co-wrote with Mia London, it's a romantic comedy series. But the very first book, Dry Spell, the two main characters, they have conflicting ideologies on what's most important to them in life. So with the heroine, her life was about work. She was a workaholic. That was how she defined her purpose. Whereas her love interest is like, no, he's gone beyond that. He's like, no, life is about enjoying yourself and spending time with the people you love. And he kind of had this lazy jokester kind of attitude that she that she actually at the point kind of resented a little bit, that he always, he never took life seriously. He was always joking around, and just that natural differing views on their lives around them created that conflict.
Yeah. And see, and that's what makes things like so interesting. It makes me want to keep turning the page, right? As a reader. Yeah. And that's what you want in your readers. You want them engaged in the story and interested. Okay, what's going to happen next? I got to know. Throughout a story, there can be more than one external conflict facing characters. And those conflicts can range from like the main storyline, the main plot, to a smaller subplot, or even kind of like side quests, if you will, for characters. Like, how many conflicts do you think a story can kind of benefit from? Or how do you juggle multiple conflicts in a story? Because I know that there can be too many if you're not careful.
Yes. There can definitely be too many, particularly the ones that take too much focus away from the main conflict. Now, the rules get a little different when, like, for example, if you're writing fantasy, right? And normally with fantasy and supernatural, they get to, or paranormal, I'm sorry, the natural world building that you do with those and all the characters that are involved. Yes, you're going to have more external conflicts throughout, but in general, I would say at the very least, one external and one internal conflict for every main character. And that's minimum. Obviously, most people would eventually, as you start writing, you're going to find that, oh, wow, there's more conflict I can put in here. There's more conflict that goes in there. But for the most part, at the very least, you have to have one internal, one external per main character. But with all the different ones that I like to layer in with my stories, I have to keep track of it. I have to plot it out. And I know that goes against what a lot of other writers do, where they literally just pants it. I have to write it down and plot it.
Is that so funny that I actually thought of that when I was writing this question? I remember your spreadsheet you showed me.
I have spreadsheets. It's color coded. I know that would probably put a couple people into the fetal position, but it's the only way I can keep track of, okay, I've introduced conflict A and conflict B and C, and I need to resolve conflict B or C before I introduce conflict D and E. And it's just the way my mind works. So otherwise, if I pants it, I write myself into a corner, and then I have to backtrack and cut words, which kills me most.
I know. And you know what? I actually started doing that. I actually started making a spreadsheet because and then I saw another author on Instagram and TikTok do that. Like she was showing like kind of some of her process, and she actually wrote out the tropes that she used to kind of keep to keep her really like honed in, and then like started tracking, okay, in this like around the first half, I'm going to do this, and this, and then second half they get together and they do this, and this. And like, it was just kind of main action beats. And then the tropes she was going to use to help with that story. And I thought that was a fabulous idea because I sometimes lose those threads, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And it's so easy to do. I know I've done that before, and it drives me nuts when I see that in a story of any sort, TV, movie, or like, a book, because sometimes I will just grasp onto one storyline and I'm like, where did it go though? It just disappeared out of nowhere. It came in, introduced, and then you left me hanging on it because I don't know what happened now. It's going to drive me nuts. But I love that rule of thumb, the one internal, one external conflict. And sometimes those external conflicts can kind of be the same, because you mentioned fantasy, and I was kind of watching a fantasy show the other day, and like it was kind of a group, this ragtag group of like fighters, right? Who were in a kind of like this guild together, and they're going off to fight a dragon, but they all have the same kind of external conflicts. They all have different internal conflicts, but they all have the main external one of like, how do we fight these dragons? How do we kind of save this town that we call our home? So that was kind of, I think that is such a smart way to kind of bond the characters together at the same time, but also show them as individual people and give them their own personalities. And like you said, their own kind of internal conflicts that they have to resolve as well. Love that. I think that is a fabulous idea. I will have to remember that when I track my spreadsheet.
Glad I can help.
In a previous episode, I was actually talking to Bree Unabashedly. She is the podcast host of the Categorically Romance podcast. And we were talking about how she feels anxious when reading romantic suspense. I actually mentioned that the stakes involved might be the thing that's escalating her heart rate, right? It's the stakes are an integral part of external conflict. You know, what do I risk of losing if I don't achieve this, or if I'm not able to attain this? And I have a bad habit of getting ahead of myself and raising stakes too high too often. You know, I go straight to like, this person can be killed like within like the first act. And someone's like, I don't know, like I could see people tapping out from that because it's just too much too quick, you know, like, so sorry about that. So when considering stakes involved, meaning like, you know, like we were talking about, what the character stands to lose when they fail, like that's what I'm thinking about as stakes. What's a good like gut check to make sure that like the stakes align with the story we're trying to tell?
That's a fantastic question, particularly for romantic suspense writers, right? And my normal go-to question whenever I get to that point is I always ask, does this tie back into their main goal or motivation? Do the stakes matter to the main character to achieve their goal? Will they care about having that conflict resolved, right? If they truly care about it, the reader's going to care about it too, right? And that's when your heart rate gets escalated because there's so many obstacles you're putting in front of them. Are they going to get their main goal? The best stories are the ones where the readers feel so vested in the character attaining that goal after overcoming astounding odds. So we have to throw obstacles in their face, and we have to make their journey more dramatic. And there's no better way to build that tension and drama when the character faces the chance of losing their goal or their motivation failing on them. So that's why the stakes matter, so that the happily ever after is that much sweeter at the end. So
Mm-hmm. And you got whole genres based around stakes, like things like mysteries or thrillers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like those are like very high stakes, but it's also like you kind of know what you're going into when you read those books, and then they kind of integrate it, right? It's a slow integration and those stakes usually matter to the protagonist of like what you're putting at risk. If it's not like their life, well, maybe they're a detective and they're just so, mad and burly and just like, I don't care, this is the risk I took, but then it's their family who's at risk. It's something that matters to them. Like you said, that ties back into their goals or motivations. So.
Right. And it's not just with high concept. So high concept would be like your Armageddon movie, right? The deep impact. This is the end of the world kind of high concept, right? But it's not just high concept. It's also I have the romantic comedy series, the Sweet Escape series. 3 best friends, they go on their annual girls' trips together, and nothing goes as planned on any one of these trips. Each woman is in a particular phase of her life during that trip, and their goals for each book have obstacles directly against their wishes, keeping them from their goal. In Dry Spell with the workaholic lady, she meets the man who's that work isn't important anymore. He lives his life exact opposite, almost in a mocking way. And the reader's laughing out loud at several times in the way they do it, but they both face the external conflict that for her, it keeps her from her most important goal. And the stakes here is a promotion, right? And it's not end of the world thing, but it's her most important thing. It's what she's been working for forever. It relates directly back to her most important goal. So it's making the reader as invested in the character, overcoming the odds to get that goal and feeling that connection.
Exactly. So like when you're talking any kind of external conflicts, there is always stakes, no matter how, like you said, high concept or kind of mid-tier or lower concept, it might be whatever it is important to that character. That's the main thing, is that it's one of the most important things they stand to lose if they do fail, because it means everything to them, or at least a big part of maybe who they are as a person.
Right.
Do you think those stakes can change throughout the novel as well?
The stakes can change where they realize, oh, if this is what I was really going for, and this is not as important to me once I discovered that there's this thing over here, and I didn't even realize it could be like this. So for example, when you're challenging a stereotype you have in your head, and something comes across your character and they realize that the stereotype or the cliche they had in their mind isn't at all true, well then, yes, their main goal can change, which would then change the stakes, that kind of thing. And obviously there's other situations where the stakes can increase, right? You're after goal A and you realize you can't get goal A unless goal B is taken care of first. And goal B is a whole lot harder to attain than goal A. So stakes can start increasing pretty quick.
Exactly. It just makes me think of like one of your, I don't think you've announced it yet, one of your super secret projects you've been working on while we were at our writers' retreats, is that there was someone who had a goal in mind or had a stake involved, and that stake seemed to change over time because her perception was challenged through what she thought of this other character. So those stakes kind of changed and shifted a bit to kind of realign with her mindset.
Correct. And thank you. I'm hoping to have that super secret project out next year. So
yeah. So if you want to know what that super secret project is, you definitely need to follow Susie. I'm just saying.
Yes, please.
But definitely that was what I kind of thought of, is like, okay, those stakes can change over time, I think, too. So that's something to make sure that as we're writing, I think, especially me, like something I have to take into consideration, because that is true. Our characters kind of evolve, right? They do evolve as we write the story. And so like their perceptions are changed, they're challenged. And a lot of times, sometimes those stakes do also change with them. It just depends on what the stake is and how much it impacts the character of their frame of mind and stuff. Like the high concept, I don't think would change too much. You pretty much got to save the world at that point.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to change of like, nah, just let it go. Just let it go. Let's start over. whenever like I was just talking about it kind of when I was mentioning your super secret project, like whenever our writers group has a plot issue, we come to you to help fix us. Like that's how Chrissy loves to say it. So, and that's pretty much true. And you tend to ask a series of very specific questions that kind of help identify what would be the next beat of the story. I know when I came to you with some of my kind of romantic suspense noir story, I said, Susie, I have no clue what to do here next. I had a character who was stuck in this place. He doesn't want to be there. It was like a formal kind of gala thing. He's definitely goes against everything he believes in. He doesn't like this. It's like peacocking. He hates it. But I need to get him to another place is basically what happened. And then you started asking me some really specific questions. And when I told you, you said, okay, we'll have basically this other character come in and get him to this next place. This character that would already automatically be in this, from what I had told you, be at this gala and just naturally. And of course they come in, they cause a little ruckus, and then the person, that main character, follows them to this next place that they need to be. Yeah. So that was like super eye-opening to me. And I was just like, of course, like once you help me identify it, the light bulb goes off and says, of course they would have done that. Why wouldn't it have happened that way? What questions can writers ask themselves if they're not sure how to get to a resolution for their character's external conflict, like the next beat? Like I feel like that's how writers look at it. We know where the beginning, we know where the end is. We just need to find out where that messy middle, how to navigate that messy middle.
Right. And I remember that conversation. I start asking questions around what is that character's worst fear, or what is the worst thing that could happen to them in this particular point. And if you're not sure of where to take the scene, target the why behind the fear. Why are they afraid of that? Or why is that the worst thing that could happen to them? And ask, and then the next thing you do in that scene is target the why. So going back to Royals of Solana for Gemma, who's probably one of my favorite heroines in all my books. Her first primary fear was losing Raina, her grandmother figure who essentially raised her. And of course, in the true conflict storyline, we have to make our main characters face their worst fear. So Gemma loses Raina in the worst way. And the worst way was because she was unable to protect Raina, despite all of her efforts and despite her, great sure shot, trigger happy skills. But I take that beyond the fear. Why was she afraid of losing her? Why was she so afraid of not being able to protect the one she loves? Because she was terrified of being alone. Not the kind of, having an afternoon to yourself to go ride a horse, but the true kind of alone where there's no one to share your life with, no one for her to take care of. So that ties directly into her second biggest fear, which was being unable to make her own decisions. She spent the majority of her early childhood life without any control over her day-to-day life, and she was forced to see some really scary stuff. So with Raina gone, her first fear is realized. And as she goes on this journey to protect Andre, which was Raina's last wish, and sees that his world of royal protocol and being spotlighted on the world stage, she loses her ability to make her own life decisions. So if she wants to stay with Andre, she has to give that up, which makes her feel like she's back in her childhood and she has no ability to make any of her own choices. Now, in true Gemma style, she's a fighter and refuses to let other people see her fears, right? Because to her, fears are like weaknesses, which creates all kinds of side conflict and tensions. But when you take the conflict back to your character's main goals and directly address the main fears, dive deeper and ask why they're so afraid of it. Target the why. and then figure out if their why makes them stronger once they go through it, or a way to solve for their why. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I like how you honed in of like, it's the why, because that's kind of what you did ask me was like, what is this character's worst fear? What are they concerned about the most? And his worst fear came true. It was this woman he loved or beginning to love was kind of taken from him. She was kidnapped, she was taken and put in this other location. That's why that's how we got there of like, that's how he ends up in a different location. That's how he got to that location, because the worst fear did happen for him, that she was in danger and he was worried he couldn't protect her. Yeah. And then it forces him to basically confront that fear and say, like, what do I do next? And of course he goes, I think that's based on the personality of of your character that you're building. Of course, that character is resilient, like Gemma is, right? And kind of fights through it and kind of says, I'm going to confront it. I don't like it, but I'm going to do it. Yeah. Right. And then it results. And for me, and that's why it was a big piece of it, because it resulted in the big showdown of like going to this other location. I just needed to know, how did I get there? And that's a wonderful question to ask of like, what is the why? The why of the character, of why they're doing this, why they're worried about it. Why is there, what is their worst fear? So, and what if it does come true? Because sometimes it does too, depending on what the stakes are.
Right. And of course, that's what the reader wants to read most, right?
Yeah.
They want to see that. That's the part you need to get to.
Yeah. So. I just want to see my characters suffer and then get over it and then like fall, and then have a happily ever after. But exactly. I like a little bit of suffering first.
We have to make them suffer a little bit, right? It's realistic.
I mean, exactly. It's just, it's just a natural part of it, because then it wouldn't make it interesting for me,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
While I was doing my research about our episode for external conflict, I came across a suggestion stating that external conflict should change a character. Now, do you think that is the case when writing external conflict? We kind of touched upon it a little bit earlier when we were talking about stakes. Sometimes those stakes can change and do change, but should it change a character even if it's minimally, do you think? Like, does it have to change a character? Let me put it that way.
I think it actually kind of has to. It's only natural. If someone is being faced with your worst fear and you have to live through it, your biggest goal in life is being challenged, right? One or the other. Inevitably, you have to change something. Otherwise, they won't be able to get past the struggle, right? They won't be able to face the fear. And obviously, when you face your fear, you feel a little bit different afterward, right? It might take a couple of days, right, to get over the fact that, yes, I'm afraid of heights and I just stood at the top of the bridge to do a bungee jump, right? But it's going to take you're going to change. You're not going to be as terrified of it, or your overall internal thought process is going to change. Mm-hmm. So yes, there has to be something that changes the character to get past the conflict or to get over the fear. Mm-hmm. Change is inevitable for everyone. It's a fact of life. And if your character doesn't change, there's really no forward movement through the story. The reader doesn't feel as vested in this character's development. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Because that's what I was thinking too. The reason this question in particular popped up is because I'm a glutton for punishment. I put in some of the questions. I'm just like, all right, what are the questions AI comes up with? Because I don't want to ask those. But one thing, I want to ask more interesting questions. But one of the questions that AI posed was that about external conflict changing a character. And I was just like, well, does it have to change a character? But I do agree with you. I think it does to a certain degree, because even if it is minimally, because there is the character, you don't want the character starting out or like ending how they started out. Mm-hmm. Unless you're Stephen King, then you can do that. But I'm sorry, Dark Tower lovers who don't, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, but yeah, but it made it very interesting, right? He was completely changed, and then he threw a reverse Uno card at us. But I think there is a certain extent the character has to change, because you can't go through with all these risks and all these stakes and be the same person, I think, after that. Like
Exactly.
after all this conflict, after all these stakes are raised, depending on what they look like, that are very, like we talked about, very important to the character and still feel like the same person. Yeah. Like just like all your characters, they ended up with, they found the loves of their lives and,
They did.
and they found a good happily ever after that worked for them. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
and some of the really emotionally satisfying endings are the ones where yes, they found their happily ever after, and it's kind of almost not 100% the exact opposite of when they started out, but when you see that irony at the end, I love throwing in that sometimes where they realize at the end, oh, well, my absolute worst fear was actually really not a big deal. Or going back to Royals of Solana with Princess Alana, which is Andre's sister, and her story, and her she meets up with Flynn, who rescues her to help her get off the island. And Flynn realizes after everything he and Princess Alana have gone through, he doesn't really want a life of solitude on the sea anymore. That was his original goal at the beginning of the book. And at the end of the book, his original goal isn't nearly enough for him anymore. He wants a life with Alana, and he's willing to sacrifice that solitary life with one beside a princess in the spotlight because he's changed. So his happily ever after is a little bit ironic because it kind of went against what his original fears were. So how has he changed? Before, with the difficulties that he faced in life, he has high functioning autism. So he's never been able to look anyone directly in the eye. And he's never had that really deep connection with where someone accepts what he's considered flaws in himself. And now that he's found Alana, who doesn't consider any of those things flaws and cherishes him just as he is, he's discovered that connection with her is far more valuable. And that's his happily ever after. So they've got that kind of dueling dichotomy thing going.
Yeah. And that's the kind of change in a character I love, you know, like, or even in some of those things kind of going back to what we were talking about before, some of those ideas or that change can even be in perception of like, you thought this character or the situation was a certain way, but now you have a new perspective of it and it's completely different from what you thought it was. Mm-hmm. So it's the growth I think we seek to find in a lot of our stories, right? I think is seeing these characters grow and build these relationships and find these connections, you know, because I think that's what all stories are.
It's like what Jane Austen mastered, right? With Pride and Prejudice, like the ultimate complete change in perspective. Yeah. That's what we all strive for, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's all what we're all chasing that dream. So we've talked a lot about like all these great books, you know, your super secret projects and like all this external conflict. So where can listeners find your books and how can they connect with you?
Oh, yes. Always on my website, susansheehey.com. You can find my books on Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, all the main retailers. I have several audiobooks out now as well. Some on Audible, some on Apple audiobooks. I have a twice a month newsletter where I send out updates along with goodies and freebies with other romance novel news with each email. It's a place where people get first access to my new releases and first notices of deals, advanced reader copies, things like that. So sign up for that at susansheehey.com. And if anyone needs any developmental editing help, I'm also available. Just reach out to me on my website.
Thanks so much to Susan for joining the show. Be sure to follow me on social media at Romance the Story. That way you can keep up with new and prior guests, as well as episodes to come. And if you're enjoying the content, please follow, share, or leave a review. It greatly helps the podcast. Book recommendations for this episode: The Prince of Solana by Susan Sheehey and Dry Spell by Mia London and Susan Sheehey. As always, stay safe, be well, and keep writing.